Now we are ready to talk about our second unit, talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. We're going to talk about the aggregate demand. So what is the aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the real GDP demanded. Here we're not talking about one good and one service like it was the case in microeconomics. Here we're talking about all goods and services. So Y, which represent the GDP, is the total amount of final goods and services produced in a country that people, consumption, businesses, investment, government purchases, and foreigners, exports plan to buy. So the quantity and the sum of the C, I, G, X minus M actually represent the real GDP. As we know that from the expenditure approach that we encounter when we were talking about measuring GDP and economic growth, that the expenditure approach will state that the GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus exports minus imports. So aggregate demand is actually the total of the 5 components: C, I, G, X minus M. What are the factors that may affect the buying plans, the demand, the aggregate demand? We actually will talk about 4 of them: the price level, expectation about inflation and about future profit, fiscal policy and monetary policy, which are the tools that the government use to influence the economy, the world's economy and the changes in the economy around us. So let's see. So first we're going to talk about the aggregate demand and the price level, the buying plans and the price level. So the aggregate demand is the relationship between the price level and quantity of real GDP demanded. It's similar to microeconomics demand. However, in microeconomics we're talking about one good and the relationship between the quantity demanded of this good and its price. Here we're talking about all goods and services, the GDP and the price level. So the aggregate demand curve plots the quantity at each level of price level, how much quantity of real GDP will be demanded. Let's see the curve. It's, as you can see, on the x-axis we have a real GDP, on the y-axis we have the price level. It's downward sloping, representing that the higher the price level, the lower is the quantity, the aggregate demand, okay, or the quantity of real GDP demanded. However, if there is a decrease in a price level, this means that the quantity demanded will go up. Why is that? This is actually attributed to 2 factors: the wealth effect and the substitution effect. Let's dig deeper to understand why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, what is the effect of the wealth, and what is the effect of substitution. So if there is an increase in a price level, this means that the real value of your wealth will go down. When the value of your wealth will go down, this means that people will be actually afraid more about the future. They will try to regain the same trust they had about the future, so they will buy less and save more. Let's take another example. You're actually planning to go and to fulfill your MBA degree from outside Egypt. This project will cost you £1 million, and you are actually planning to go after 3 years. So you decided that you will save each month, you will save £30,000 for 3 years, so you can go for your MBA outside the country. So what if the price of the MBA went up to 1,500,000? What will happen now for your saving? Will you keep the same level of saving? Of course not. You're gonna increase your level of saving if you want to keep with your goal. So what happened here is when the price level went up, the value of your savings went down. So you need to save more in order to regain the same value of your wealth. And on the other hand, let's take it on the other side of the story. You had an acre of land that actually was very cheap. Suddenly its price went up as there is a mega project will be built by it. So now your acre of land was for 10,000 pounds, for example. Now it's for 100 million. Do you need to save more? Actually, no, because actually wealth went up, and this means that you actually don't need to save more. So this gives us an example. This example will show us how would a change in wealth change your buying behaviors. So the bottom line in here, the increase in the prices will lead to a decrease in the buying plans as people see that the real value of their wealth will go down. Meanwhile, the decrease in the prices means that your real wealth value went up and you need to save less, and thus and you can buy more. So with real wealth, people decrease saving and increase spending, so the quantity of real GDP demanded increase. So more wealth, more buying. What about another application for how would a change in the price change the appetite of people to buy or not to buy? Here we're talking about intertemporal substitution effect. What do you mean by intertemporal substitution effect? That when a price level goes up, this may affect the interest rate and push the interest rate to go up too. And as interest rates go up, this means a better opportunity for saving and a higher opportunity cost for consumption. So if you woke up one day and you find this ad from one bank telling you that there is an opportunity of getting 30% interest a year, so will this encourage you to save more or to spend more? Of course, it will encourage you to seize the opportunity and to save more. So there is a negative relationship between the interest rate and the consumption. So faced with a higher interest rate, people try to borrow and spend less, so the quantity of real GDP demanded will decrease. So interest rates goes up, this means less spending. Now let's talk about the international dimension that will actually lead that the aggregate demand will be downwards looping, going down. Aggregate demand or quantity demanded of GDP will go down as the prices goes up. When there is a rise in the price in our country, this means that our prices are higher relative to other countries. So the other countries will find that their imports from our country are more expensive, and it's better to buy domestic goods than to buy the imported goods with your country with a higher price. So a rise in a price level, other things remaining the same, increase the price of domestic goods relative to foreign goods. So imports increase as our people will substitute the more expensive domestic goods with less expensive imported goods. And on the other hand, other countries will decrease their imports from our higher priced or high priced exports. So similarly, a fall in the price level will do the opposite. So if our domestic prices went down, this means that people will go for the domestic goods that are cheaper than the imports, and other countries will start increasing their imports from our less expensive goods, and this will increase the exports. So aggregate demand is downwards looping because of the wealth effect, the intertemporal effect, and also the change in the effect of international substitution. Now let's talk about the other factors that will affect the aggregate demand. We agreed that there are 4 factors. The first one was the price level. Let's talk about the rest 3, or the rest of the 4. The first one is expectations. So let's talk about expectations and its relationship with the aggregate demand. So expectation about the future includes expectation about inflation and expectation about profit. So if we are expecting higher inflation in the future, this will push people to buy more now. Let's take an example. If you are expecting that cars prices will increase, will you keep your same plans to buy it next year? Of course not. You will try to rush it up and try to buy your car before the prices goes up. So if there is an expectation of higher inflation, this will lead to a higher aggregate demand and a higher quantity demanded of the GDP. Same case goes for income. If people are expecting higher income in the future, this means that they don't need that much saving, or they can decrease their saving level buying more, and by buying more, this means that more demand on aggregate supply, on GDP or real GDP. For companies, if companies are expecting higher profit, this actually will encourage them for more investment to seize the opportunity of higher profit. Of course, vice versa for the three, expecting lower inflation, expecting lower income, expecting lower profit, will actually cause the aggregate demand to shift to the left and less demand over the real GDP. Now, what about fiscal policy? So we have been introduced to a relationship between aggregate demand and the price level, aggregate demand and expectations. Now let's talk about fiscal policy and the aggregate demand. And of course, we're going to talk in more details about fiscal policy in the coming chapters. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we are talking about the government attempt to influence the economy through manipulating taxation and spending. So the government, in its core process, will collect taxes and start spending these taxes over services to the community or the society or to the country. Building roads, opening universities, supporting the defense activities, etc. So the government, by manipulating or by controlling or by changing taxes and expenditure, they can alter the aggregate demand. So a tax cut, an increase in transfer payment, increase household disposable income. What do we mean by that? Here we're talking about some of our income, or part of our income, will go for taxes. So we are unable to spend it, as it is in the hands of the government. So if the government decided to decrease the tax rate, this means that we have more available income to spend, which we call it disposable income. And as we have more available income to spend, this means a higher demand over the real GDP. So an increase in disposable income increases consumption expenditure and increases the aggregate demand. On the other hand, the government itself is a player in the market, and their procurement or their purchases and their expenditure would affect the aggregate demand. So because the government purchases of goods and services is one of the components of the aggregate demand, let me remind you of the aggregate demand components, which were C, I, G, X minus M. So here we are talking about the G, which is the government purchases. It's a part of the aggregate demand. So an increase in the government expenditure means an increase in demand, and it is an increase in the G. Now, let us talk about monetary policy. When we talk about monetary policy, it's the change in the interest rate and the quantity of money, and it's mainly controlled by the central bank of each country. So when there is an increase in quantity of money, this means that people have more buying power, they have more money in their hands, they can spend more, and aggregate demand would increase, and vice versa. If there is a decrease in the interest rate, this means that people will be less interested in saving and more interested in spending or making more consumption. Maybe if the interest rate went down dramatically, that they withdraw their money from interest-bearing assets and to inject it into the market, causing the aggregate demand to increase. So, what about the world economy? Now we are done with the price level, expectations, fiscal policy, monetary policy, Now we are ready to talk about the effect of the world economy over the aggregate demand. A fall in the foreign exchange rate lowered the price of domestic goods and services relative to the foreign goods and services, increases exports and decreases imports. Here we're talking about the relationship between the exchange rate and the aggregate demand. So if there is a depreciation, a decrease in the value of the domestic currency, this actually will make our goods cheaper for other countries. So other countries will be encouraged to import more from us. This will cause the exports to go up. On the other hand, the foreigners' goods for us will be more expensive. Do you remember when there was a devaluation for the Egyptian pound in 2016? What happened is the price of the Egyptian pound slumped against the dollar by 50%, and this caused the imported good to be very expensive and actually decreased our imports, or at least the growth rate of our imports, and meanwhile it contributed to the increase of our exports. On the other hand, we have a change in income. If there is an increase in the income of foreign countries, this will mean more exports for us, as an increase in income means there is an increase in demand on most of goods and services, and thus the exports is included out there, and we have an increase in our export and thus the aggregate demand. Let's take a look on the aggregate demand curve and see how would these factors affect the curve graphically. If there is factors that would cause the aggregate demand to increase, it will shift the curve to the right, and if the factors will actually lead to decrease in aggregate demand, it will shift the curve to the left. So aggregate demand is talking about the buying plans for all goods and services produced in the country. 4 or 5 components are there: CIG, X minus M. We are also talking that price level would affect the aggregate demand inversely, meaning a higher price level means less aggregate demand, lower price level means a higher aggregate demand, because of the substitution effect and the wealth effect. Other factors that may affect the aggregate demand are expected higher inflation, expected higher income, expected higher profit. All of these will lead to a higher aggregate demand and a shift to the right, and vice versa. The effect of the world economy comes from the change in the exchange rate, and when the value of our currency will go down, this will encourage exports, discourage imports, increasing the aggregate demand, and vice versa. Government can influence the aggregate demand through lowering the taxes, increasing government expenditure, lowering interest rate, increasing the quantity of money. See you next unit.